Hi, my name is Chris Pullenayegem. I'm the director of the Initiative for Congregational Vitality at the Vancouver School of Theology. This interview is the second in a two-part series that hopes to highlight the experiences of congregations that have intentionally moved towards being intercultural. And it is my pleasure to continue to converse with Reverend Bill Millar, but also a real privilege to introduce to you Damber Khakda, a critical player in all of this, and whose story I'm sure you would love to hear as the conversation unfolds. So I'm going to ask you, Bill, if you don't mind, to introduce Damber and tell us a little bit about him, and then we'll pick up the conversation from part one. Is that okay? Can I ask you to do that, please?
Sure. I'm stuck because I have such profound respect for Damber. Damber literally wandered into the church one Sunday, and almost from that day until today, Damber has been my mentor. I have learned so much from his wisdom and from his tenacity, from his insight coming from a very different cultural context. I believe Damber is brilliant, but I'm not limiting that to the mind. I think he is brilliant in his heart and in his love and in his passion for community, in his faith. And so it has been a remarkable honor of mine to be connected with him. So I'm not sure what else to say other than it's an honor.
That's good. That's good. And Damber,
yes.
I like people to know a little bit about you and your background. So just tell us, very quickly your life story, if you can say it in a minute or two, because I think people would like to know from where you come from and what you bring and who you are. So.
Sure. My name is Damber Khakda, and originally I was from Bhutan, and I spent over 2 decades of my time in the refugee camp in Nepal. And from Nepal, I moved to Canada as a refugee immigrant in 2009. As I landed in Winnipeg and being a Christian from back home, I was looking for a church. And accidentally, I got into the Knox United Church building. And I happened to see people from all races, from all ethnicities, and from all over the world. And under the same roof, worshiping God and being a community there. And I was surprised at my first entrance, and a lady from Philippines origin came to me. She approached me and she asked my name, and she gave me a piece of paper to write my name, and I did that. And she introduced me to Reverend Bill Millar, the minister at that time. And I was so surprised that how could a white man in front of the pulpit, he was just welcoming me with his all heart. And on the very first day, he allowed me to speak to the congregation in order to introduce myself. And it was not something new to me to introduce myself to the congregation, because I was used to standing in front of the pulpit and speak to hundreds of people. But still, in that context, in that being a new immigrant to that space, I would feel some kind of uncomfortable, difficulty, like how would I just introduce myself? Like I'm just a refugee and I'm just landed here, and I don't know what would be the future like. But I made up my mind to share my story briefly to the whole congregation. And as soon as I'm done with my introductory part, I went back to my pews and I sat there, and people started coming to me I have been visited by many different people, like from Philippines, from Africa, from Japan, from different ethnicities. People would come and just introduce themselves to me, and I introduced myself to them. And there was a kind of, I could feel a sense of connectivity between us, no matter where we were from originally. It didn't really matter to us. It didn't even really matter whether I would be able to understand their action.
Accent.
Yeah, but just, our eyes could speak each other. Our heart would
Hearts.
connect each other. And that's kind of expression that I felt that very moment. And immediately I thought, this should be my community. This should be my place.
Great, thank you. That's great. A question about your background. So you said you were a Christian. Were your parents Christian, or did you go through a conversion experience to become a Christian in the refugee camp? Or?
I'm a converted Christian from the Hindu. My parents were a Hindu. Actually, there's a very interesting story. Actually, I was in love with a Christian girl. My wife is a Christian then, and I was still Hindu, and my marriage would not be accepted anyways. So both sides, like neither my parents nor Sumitra's parents would accept our relationship. So we decided to elope. We ran away from home. We got married just by ourselves, and we returned to home, but there was no space for us. And we managed to find a small hut in the camp, and we started living there. And a year later, my first child was born. And that's the struggle that I witnessed, I encountered, and I had to bear in the refugee camp. Just how different it would be like being in the different faith. And there was no connection between the Christian and the Hindu people. They were anti to one another, like they would not be in favor of any way, like in favor of other religions. So I was in between that.
Well, were all your children born in the refugee camp as well?
Yes, both of them born in the refugee camp, and and they grew up as refugee. And when we came here in 2009, my eldest child was 12 years old, and the younger one was 10 years old only. And that's how I came here. And after my marriage, after 2 years of my marriage, I decided to convert to Christian, because I could not stay like that in between situation. Like either I need to be Hindu or I need to be Christian.
Make up your mind.
Yes, that's the societal norms actually. Right. That's the societal norm, and I cannot be two person. I need to choose one. So I decided to become a Christian because I wanted to respect my wife's faith. So because that's what her belief is, and I accepted that, and I'm converted from there on.
Great. Yeah. And just to round things off, right now, what are you doing, Damber?
Currently, I'm in my education at Atlantic School of Theology in Halifax. I'm a student for Master of Divinity. This year is my third year, going to be over soon, and I'll be stepping into fourth year from this June on. And I decided to perceive the way that I have experienced at Knox. I have seen the faith flowing from person to person, and the inclusiveness that the United Church has in its place is the main attraction to me. That attracted me, like, oh, okay. This must be the right place for me to flourish.
Yes.
This must be the right place for me to practice my faith. So that's what I felt deeply and decided to enter into the ministry. From the Baptist background to the United Church background.
And you're a pastor, you're doing pastoral work at Knox as well.
Yeah, I'm a student minister for Knox at this point, and I'm also looking after another congregation, Nepali-speaking ethnic congregation. The same congregation meet with the broader community in intercultural worship service in the morning at 10:30. And as soon as we are done with that service, we'll move to the chapel and do the service again in Nepali language. Well, that's why we have the dual face.
I was privileged to be a part of that service at once when I visited Knox here. Great. Bill, this question is for you. Thank you, Damber, for that. I think it just gives us a really good perspective of who you are and how you come to this point. Bill, so what part did Damber play in the transition from a traditional, more white church to what it is now? I know that it was diverse before Damber walked in, but I mean, after he walked in, what part did he play, Bill?
You know, it's interesting, Damber. I'll be interested in your reflections on this, because so much of this whole process was intuitive. We never really knew what we were doing or where we were going. It's just that God would sort of lead us. So here this guy shows up, and then family, and then all these Nepali-speaking folk started attending. And at that point, many of them were new Christians or just in the process of converting. And I remember asking in the United Church, do we have any resources? And everybody said, what do you mean? We've never had a convert. Like one year we did like 18 baptisms. And I mean, I think you said you've done more adult baptisms in Winnipeg than the rest of the United Church that year in the whole country.
For 5 years at least.
Yeah. And but there were a number of things that happened, but one of them was that, and I don't think we've ever talked about this, Damber, the Nepali-speaking folk, when they arrived, found the Filipino group found common heart somehow. Like there were tensions at times between the Filipino and West African sort of things, but there was something common between these two communities. And so the need of the Nepali-speaking group as they arrived allowed the Filipino group to move into active ministry in a different way and to provide a different kind of leadership. So they got to exercise the ministry of welcome by welcoming these people and being them. And they had the commitment and the dedication to be with those families in those early years in many, many ways on a mentoring basis. So there was a kind of a reciprocal relationship between these two. The other piece that happened was I remember, and I think we might have talked about this even last time, but I remember one time when we had healing services quite often, about once a month or something, where people could come forward in prayers for healing. And it would be, they would get laying on of hands and anointing with oil and a prayer. And these folk who were attending, none of them spoke English. And so most of the time when the service was going on in English, you'd look out and they were just like vacant stares, like, or they'd be talking to one another about something else during the service. But when they came forward for this healing, their eyes fixed on, and Damber and I were standing there. I can remember that day so clearly, the first time it happened, and their eyes fixed, and I knew that they were worshiping. And I knew that it was tied to experience, not tied to intellect. So the laying on of hands, the experience of the oil, and so that began to help me, I think, and us to be able to understand that we use Westerhoff's different stages of faith, but we used it as modes of faith, of experience-based, affiliation-based, searching-based, and owned faith. And so that we would try to have worship that encompassed all of those elements. So I think the other piece was the turn around when they first. I remember saying to Damber, at one point, because in the beginning we thought they had come because they needed us, that we needed to support them. And then one day I turned to Damber, I said, Damber, I realized that, I thought you were coming because you needed us, but I realize now that you were coming because we needed you. And Damber looked at me and just said, yes, Rav. Like, Shiloh, what, you didn't know that?
Yeah.
That's a reality.
It was. So.
Wow. So, Damber, I mean, how do you describe your journey in that process of, from the time you entered the church to now? How would you describe your journey and your community?
You mean during the transition?
Yeah, during the transition.
Yes. Actually, we didn't do much during that time. Like, I was receiving new immigrants from Nepal who were landing at the airport, and I was the one to receive them in the airport. Every member, I received them at the airport and bring them to their temporary residence at welcome place. And from the airport itself, I used to introduce myself as a pastor. Okay, welcome to Winnipeg. I'm a pastor for Nepali speaking community, and we gather as a broader community at Knox, and we will have 2 shifts of worship services. You are welcome to join, and we welcome you.
So evangelism from the beginning.
Yes, that's right. And do not hesitate, whatever your faith may be. We don't care about that. Just as a human being, we are here to support each other. So that would be my welcoming statement always. So that can create people, oh, okay, even though I'm not a Christian, I can still go to church. I will not lose by going there. Yeah, that's what would be the concept that I always try to put in people's brain.
So question, at any time, did anyone think that you were trying to convert them?
No, I don't think so. Good. They kept coming. The church, they attended the several services. We didn't force them. We didn't put any kind of pressure or any restrictions or limitations in place. We just allowed people to be part of our gathering, the meeting. That's it. And at the end of the service, I would visit every people there and spend at least 30 seconds of my time.
So they were basically looking for community.
Exactly. That's, I guess so. We can assume that because otherwise it would not make sense to me that why should they come to the Christian church instead of going to a Hindu temple? So that would be the need there.
I like that because you are not giving them any preconditions for being community. You're saying, welcome, be part of a community.
Exactly.
And if you want to align yourself with the faith that we profess, that's fine, but that's on you, right? There's no, oh, what a wonderful story. So just a transition, in the process of transitioning from where you were to where you are now, and this is for Damber and Bill, both of you, what are some of the challenges you faced? And I'm talking about all kinds of challenges, can be systemic challenges, just operational, just Sunday challenges, you name it, as it comes to you.
Interesting question. Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, we had been through a lot of challenges and struggles on the way in the process. Like people would question me, like, firstly, they happen to see the homosexuality as a pillar standing between their faith and themselves. And how is it possible that a man can marry a man and a girl can marry a girl? So we cannot consume this. We cannot digest this. That's what is this, Pastor? Please explain us a bit. So I can still remember that one Sunday I just focused on what homosexuality is. And I try to explain that this is not us who would be judging on these people. Allow God to do his work. This is not us. We as a human being, we are just to welcome them. And the judgment will come from God, not from man, not from people. So that's what my main teaching was at the time. And the people were convinced of, oh, okay, that's not our business. Let God do his business, right? So that's the understanding I developed in the brain. And it made a little bit easier for me to play the role of Moses.
Yes.
And I traveled that journey. I showed the cloud of a cloud during the night and the fire during the day. That's what I witnessed along the way. And it was never easy. But my hope was always to focus being a community. Being a community so that we can welcome regardless of what their faith is. That is the central point where we can gather as a human being. So no one has seen God. No one has witnessed God. We relied on our faith like, okay, there is always hope in God. But no one has conceived that. No one has encountered that. And so what is the central point is that just be welcoming. That's I think the openness is the ingredient.
So community, yeah.
Yeah. Openness is the ingredient to pull people together and bring into that common space. So there were lots of questions that people would raise, and I needed to answer them. Sometimes I was stuck, so I needed to go to Reverend Bill, and I said, "Oh, people are asking this question. I don't know how do I answer them." So, and he would just give me some kind of guidance. Okay, our theology says this one. Our doctrine says this. Our philosophy, United Church of Canada's philosophy is this. So if we center all these ideologies together, and this will give us a new way. So, okay. And I just followed his advices, his suggestions along the way. And everything made it easier for me, like, even though the journey was really tough. But
that's great. And thank you for that insight. In terms of the intercultural transition, Bill, any challenges? I know you face a lot of them. What are some that you can name?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because prior to the issue of gay issues, in some ways, the Nepali-speaking community wasn't even as divisive, but for some of our other communities, it was much more challenging because for people to attend, they could even be ostracized from their own communities.
Yes.
I think of like Sudanese, or a number of the African countries, it could be very strong. Yeah. But before, a number of years before Damber arrived, we didn't know how are we going to deal with this. And one of the things that we realized is that we didn't come to this place on our own out of some great enlightenment. We stood on the shoulders of those who went before us, who were creating a more open and inclusive church. So we came up with a simple thing of one, we asked people when we would talk about this, we said, we want you to listen to our testimony. We want to tell you our story. And because we believe that God has led us to this place, we ask you to simply believe that we have come to this place because God led us here. And then we want you to pray. With those three things, and it was never an issue. We took those three things. We didn't require anybody to be anywhere, to have any opinions, to change their minds on anything, knowing that they're coming from very different contexts. But it was the power. Really, it was just asking that people listen to our testimony and then accept that we believe that we're here because God led us, and then to be open and themselves pray. One of the other pieces, of course, is that in many of the communities, like not all, Filipino group didn't come primarily as refugees, but many of our people came as refugees. So there was trauma history all over the place. So people got trauma. And that means that there were times that people would bump up against each other and it would be very uncomfortable. And that was just a part of it. We just would know.
Was there any deliberate, intentional interventions for that kind of trauma healing things? Or were there other community agencies that were actually doing that and providing the services? Or were you
we didn't have any
yourselves?
kind, we weren't really held together by program of any kind. It would be sort of, there was and there wasn't. It would come up a lot of times, like prayer was very, very important, is, very, very important. People coming together, being able to pray together when things would happen back home, and we would get together and we would pray. Ours was a very poor community. At times we were able to come up with thousands of dollars to get to people. And I never quite know how it would happen. It would just happen. And we would somehow raise money or things like that. I think the biggest thing, Damber in one of the podcasts when I interviewed him said that he thought the most important thing was vulnerability from everybody. Just being a sort of mutual vulnerability and of giving up sense. And I think I hadn't thought of it before Damber said that, and I've thought a lot about it since then. And I think that really is the key. I think it was very, very important. And I think with trauma history, in the same way, if we're vulnerable with one another, if we know that we're all hurting, then, we kind of make room for each other. So I think that was a very important piece.
That's very wise, yeah.
I would like to add on that, the interdependency is the spot where God meets us, no matter who we are. That the interdependency between two human beings, that is the place, very spot where God meets us. And as I said earlier, our vulnerabilities could be our being minority or marginalized, or maybe the well-privileged, or whatever the state we are. But we need to come to that center point, to that space where vulnerability lies. So suppose if I see Reverend Bill as vulnerable in some ways, up to some extent, then I will bring my vulnerability to you, and we are in the same page. So, and we know our vulnerabilities are, then we may have the same kind of pain that we are traveling through. So that is the very spot where we can meet God and God can meet us. That's always my concept of where can we meet God.
These are very, really important points, like you both said. So, Bill, I got a question for you. How does that operate against power, privilege, and entitlement? So for example, here are a bunch of refugees coming into your church and kind of spilling over in the pews because there are so many of them. And then because this is something that churches who want to be intentionally intercultural are going to face. How do you leave aside power, privilege, entitlement so that you can come to the common place of vulnerability? I think that's a core concept. And how do that operate in your church, and walk us through some of the challenges and something that you might have done or not done that brought people to that point?
I think there's probably many levels. We lost people. People left.
Because of the change?
Yeah. Although they would have said it, well, it's not kind of the music that we like, or things are different. But I remember, early on, like maybe around 2006 or so, there was an old guy named Harold, and he stood at the back of the church. He was taking up the offering or something, and I was standing at the back of the church with him. And he looked over at me and he said, "Bill, I'm beginning to think," or Reverend Millar, whatever he said, I'm beginning to think, I think there's more of them now than us. And I just died inside. But I said instead, Harold, yeah, isn't it wonderful? But we had the great asset that we were in this gigantic building that we couldn't possibly afford. And we had come to know that we existed only by miracle. And most of our white people, the white group, they were poor too. Like everybody was poor. Like nobody had any money. And we didn't have anybody who was like a major donor. We had one, they stopped quite early. Otherwise, we had like no major donors. And so we existed like Elijah fed by ravens. We existed by grace alone. And that helped, I think, folk to recognize that these folk were here. We weren't operating out of strength. We needed the community.
Mm.
So when we opened our doors to the community and when we made our building accessible to the community, it was because we desperately needed the community. We couldn't be ourselves. We couldn't be who God was calling us to be without them. And so one of the other pieces of that, though very, very early, was in my preaching. I would often talk about that who gets to claim the future of this church, just the people in the pew, or the spaces between the people in the pew, the empty spaces. Because if they have a claim on the future, then how do we listen? And so there would be a lot of talk about sort of opening ourselves. So I think all of that was there. The other piece of it was that because Knox had an unusual history, they welcomed the Japanese in the middle of the Second World War when nobody would allow them in. They had a strange kind of conservatism, a unique brand of conservatism. I come to understand it better, that allowed them to do countercultural things because of their conservatism. But we were able then to draw on parts of the history and bring them forward, kind of say, this is who we, and when we look back in the history in the 1800s, this was again what the church was and who the people who were attending. And so all of those things kind of went into the package. But the other thing was that there was a lot of pain, and there were some years, I guess just in the years immediately before Damber arrived, that were very, very difficult and very painful. And so, but God never promised that it wasn't going to be painful. So, what are you going to do? Complain?
No, that's insightful. Damber, when your community was part of the church, and I'm talking about everyday, ordinary things that get in people's face, like the style of worship, or the songs, or the language, or you name it. How did you feel? Did you feel at any time that you were not wanted? I know Bill is somebody else, but what about the rest of the congregation? Did you at any time feel that maybe we're not wanted here because we do things differently? And how do you overcome those challenges, if at all?
For most of the families who were new to Christianity, as we said, that they were not converted until a couple of years later back. So being new to Christianity, they might not have felt that they couldn't differentiate what is actually should be and what should not be. But particularly for myself, I found it a very different way of even doing worship. In the beginning, I fell asleep a couple of times in the pews, and
fell asleep,
yeah, because we had a habit of jumping, dancing, shouting, yelling, and moving our body parts, while doing the worship. And it didn't happen at Knox. All old grumpy people were sitting in their pews, and they would hardly say yes if they were made to say yes. Otherwise, they would just shut their mouth and listen to the minister. And minister is the king there, and from the pulpit. So I felt so lazy, so bored, and in the beginning, because I didn't know the culture there, right? So I was new to that culture, new to that tradition. So I felt quite difficult to adjust with that. But later, after 2 years or 3 years, I have adapted. I learned the way how other people are doing things, So it brought me some kind of comfort, and Reverend Bill involved me in even the worship planning and taking some roles during the worship services. I wasn't even the lay title at that point. I was just attending the church services and be part of the leadership. there. And that taught me a lot. And I gained a lot of wisdom from the things happening around Nog. So, yeah. And even today, our youth are complaining like, when we attend the English church, oh no, we don't feel touched. We don't feel touched at all. That's what okay, how about it? During Reverend Bill's time, he used to allow youth to take the leadership of the worship. And the youth would organize their worship by themselves. And there was a kind of open space for the youth to play their faith. But we are hardly experiencing nowadays because
that's important, Bill, and I want to pick that up from with you. So how did the worship service change, and how did that sit with your other members who are not from this community, who are used to this, like Damber said, a boring service? And how do you overcome some of the pushback you might have gotten?
You have to think different levels, because on one level, things can be going on where you're sort of dealing with the head adjusting. But in the middle of this, there was an older Nepali woman who always wore a pink toque, who would dance around. He was old. She didn't speak a word of English. And she would go to all the old white people and hug them and kiss them and dance with them right in the middle of the service. They loved her. They didn't understand it. Nobody. And I would sit there thinking, I don't know what's going on. But so on the one hand, adjustment really was spirit-led. It was a lot of times things that we could not control that would just open up in ways that we wouldn't necessarily know. In the most recent podcast on music, I tell the story of the time that Henry, who was a drummer, was drumming for us. We did a call to worship where instead of words, we had him. He would drum a rhythm, and then people would bang on the pew in front of them to copy the rhythm. And we did it as a call to worship, and it ended up with everybody sort of laughing. So we would find ways to open things slowly. We started to do a cappella singing, and we started it by just dropping one verse out of Amazing Grace, the music out of one verse of Amazing Grace. Because United Church people, they're not like Mennonites or Black churches. They don't have a history of a cappella singing. Right. So we would start to do all of those things. The other piece of it was that when we started being able to learn songs that were in the language of people who were in the church that we loved, like Uncle Tio, who was Yoruba. And so then if we were learning a Yoruba song, we weren't just learning a Yoruba song, we were learning a song that was in Tio's language.
The language, yeah.
And then with the Nepalis, because the tonality is quite different. And then we didn't know anything. And then we would always go, oh man, I don't know how we're ever going to sing anything. And then the youth in one of the services, they did this song where the chorus is, hey, 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 and la, la, la. And so we went, we can do that. And everybody started being able to say, okay, let's do the hey, hey, hey song. And the young girls, when they would do dancing, because they would do a traditional dance. So for some of our older white people, it appealed to their sense of the arts. So there was a whole bunch of things, but most of the time we didn't really have a clue what we were doing. We didn't have a program, or we weren't able to do cause and effect. Right. More, you could just look back and say, oh, this is how things started to change. People hadn't had children in the church, and suddenly there were children in the church all over the place. And so so there were things that just kind of happened that allowed people to slowly make changes.
So there was permission giving for things to unfold. Good, because I think that's an important principle that a lot of churches who want to become intercultural don't give permission, right? So they have this cookie cutter kind of formula. you do this and this happens, and that's not the way it happened in your church. It's more spirit-led, organic transition.
And the other was that somebody, Leslie, who was there, somebody that she knew talked about, and I forget who gave it the name. It might have been somebody from the Center for Christian Studies. Anyways, talked about Knox as improv worship. And in some ways, that's right, because oftentimes we'd be in the middle of the service and it would go off some direction entirely different than we had expected. It would just go like zinging off in another direction. And so we just go for it. We just follow it.
I like it because sometimes we are controlled by our own controls.
Yeah.
We don't leave room for the Spirit to work. I got 2 questions more. Oh, I can talk with you guys for hours, but we have to stop sometime. So the one of the last question is, so the transition is happening. What are some of the things, and Damber, you can talk about this because you're still involved, and Bill too. What are some of the things that you need to be careful about, that it doesn't go back into a church that is locked into kind of what it was before it became intercultural improv, and that freedom of the Spirit to move and to, what are some things you need to be guard against? Do you know what I'm saying? Like it can easily become a church that's going back to dull and boring and all of the stuff because you do the same thing over and over again. What can you do to keep it alive, to keep it constantly evolving and transitioning?
I think I believe that I involved more with the planning team, worship planning team, and try to bring some kind of spices into the worship that gave some kind of eye opening to other people as well, and kept a lot. And that's the one of the thing I might probably have done at that time. So like it was really challenging because of the cultural pattern that we are bringing in from outside into that, which is already established church with their own parameter, with their own distinct tradition, that it was really, really hard for the people who came from outside to get adapted with that kind of culture. It took a while for us to get there. But yeah, like we allowed the people to, not allow, it's not the appropriate word. We just left the space open for everybody. Whoever bring what kind of gift, that they can practice it, they can implement it, or they can bring it to use. And the most thing is that we remove the barriers. We remove the barriers, whatever we had that came with the tradition to United Church. We remove that. Okay, we are a church, we are a community. Come together, let's do something new. Please bring your input. I'll bring my input there, and let's give a new look to it. So, and that's what the space that we have created. We just created that space by removing the barriers.
So does the church continue to operate with that mindset of permission giving, barrier removing? Is it still like that, the church?
I think we didn't focus on what the Greater United Church of Canada would think about us. We focus locally.
Good.
We try to survive as a neighbor to our neighboring people. And we focused totally on that. We didn't care about what United Church would say. Often we got into trouble as well. Because they thought that we didn't follow the rules. We didn't follow the tradition what the United Church had. And yeah, but we didn't care about that. We just kept doing things what we really liked happening within the community, and we tried to focus on people's happiness. That, and we took care of their faith. We took care of their faith, and that was the main ingredient that what sustained us as an intercultural church at Knox. So in lack of that, we would not be where we are today.
So what I'm hearing from you, before Bill chimes in, is if you look after the people's spiritual growth, the rest of the things will come naturally in terms of you give them permission to live that faith out in the way that they know best, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so you give permission, but also you invite people to share their own experiences. And I like that. Bill, any words of wisdom in terms of?
I think that we were very fortunate because at a certain point there was no cultural majority. And I think the problem when you get any kind of a cultural majority, especially dominant culture, but it's not limited to dominant culture, then you get privilege and then you get entitlement, because then you get a group of people who feel like, oh, it should be a certain way,
right,
because this is our cultural way. We had so many people from so many places. The other piece of that was that in Central Park, the neighborhood in which this was, especially before, it was the first landing spot for refugees in the city. It was where everybody came. So when we started, we were looking, it was primarily West African. But then the West Africans were moving out of the neighborhood, and then there was mostly Somalis, and then it changes and changes. And so it was like every 3 years, we had to then create a whole new network of neighborhood contacts to connect up with the people. And that, without realizing it, became an operating principle that we need to keep in mind, which is that I think, I'm not at Knox now, so I can't speak about, it's almost wrong for me to say what their journey should be. But in my opinion, you can't ever achieve a new stability. You have to adapt to chronic instability. Mm-hmm. And so that so anytime that you get comfortable, we're not in the promised land, we're in the Exodus, and anytime that we get comfortable, it's not good. We have to always be open. And so that state of perpetually reopening ourselves, you can't do it constantly. It's too emotionally difficult. So what you have to do, I think, is you have to do it regularly. I can't remember the difference between continuously and continually, but one of them is at repeated intervals. Yeah. You have to intentionally say, okay, we need to be open again. And so with a new group of people who might be coming from some other place, and then it could be, whatever, maybe we'll have a whole bunch of folk, coming from Myanmar or something, whatever it is. Yeah. So,
for example, I want to go. I like that thing about adapt to chronic instability. I'm going to use that if you don't mind.
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah.
Fantastic phrase. Going back to the cultural majority piece. So, supposing you get a new group of refugees, like you said, who don't like dance, right? Who have some other form of worship. How do you handle that? Say in a worship service, how do you handle the different dynamics and the different expectations, pressures, whatever you want to call them, to, in a way that glorifies God first and also keeps people together without,
I don't know if this answered it, Damber. I'm going to talk so that you can think and come up with a wiser answer. But one of the things is that things changed. Learning new music, for instance, things changed when we said, the goal when you're learning a song in a different language is for you to feel uncomfortable. That are you willing to feel uncomfortable for 3 minutes? Or do you want simply the newcomers to feel uncomfortable all of the time and you never feel uncomfortable? So one of the things is just to normalize discomfort and say, oh yeah, okay, maybe this doesn't work for you. Yep. So do you want that to be the defining thing? Or are you willing to be uncomfortable for a few minutes while I can tell you, I absolutely find the idea of dance to be terrifying. It scares me beyond what you can believe. I go to Nepali speaking worship, my heart would be beating. I had more adrenaline going through me. I was absolutely terrified. And I'm not kidding. I mean, I was absolutely petrified.
You were scared that they would ask you to dance?
Yeah. and I was like,
can you take a picture or video of Bill dancing, please, and send it to me?
Even when they came to Canmore and I was there, they so it was, I get terrified. But so all I have to do is just own okay, yeah, that's my discomfort. Okay, that doesn't mean that it has to apply to the whole group. It's just, that's mine. Okay, now this is the place where I'm. So I think normalizing discomfort, some degree of it. If you're uncomfortable all the time, it's not going to work. But if you're comfortable all the time, it's not going to work. So, yeah.
I think as a minister, I think as a minister, it becomes our a thing that we need to communicate this to the whole congregation so that they may prepare themselves ahead of time. So what to be expected. Mm-hmm. So that would give them allow them some time to prepare themselves. So I think that's the main idea. Thank you, Reverend Bill. Yeah, you did that most of the time. I can say that I observed that, I used to say something to congregation if you are bringing something new to the stage and introduce something new to the congregation, you'd just inform them ahead of time and let them know, so that they would not feel bored or may make complaint against that. So I think that's the good leadership.
Yeah, amen. What I'm hearing is, Bill and Damber, the principles that you were just talking about aren't just for intercultural churches. They are for churches who are, right? I'm going to actually curate some of these principles, and maybe I'll send them to you to add on or to, because I think there's a mine full of gems in these two interviews that we can take and apply to a church that doesn't want to be intentionally intercultural, but is struggling with, normalizing temporary discomfort. Right? If it's all the time it is uncomfortable, then you should go to another place. But the whole point about not getting into a state of comfort where you begin to exert your power and privilege and entitlement, and everything else is wrong but yours, your way of doing things. And I think that's a beautiful principle to be observed by a lot of other churches. Not forget about cross-cultural stuff.
Well, when I was doing the podcast stuff and out of the research, I used the language of intentionally open, because I think that intercultural is a methodology of being an intentionally open community.
Yeah.
I think what the goal is to be intentionally open. So, what we did at Knox, I started when I first was at Knox, I just walked around the neighborhood. And just I met the merchants. We met all these things, but it's just being open to people outside your door. How can you be open? So maybe it is, and that neighborhood was very intercultural, but had it been different, say had it been, street gangs or something, well, then maybe we would have had a street gang ministry, whatever it was, but it's the process of being intentionally open. And one element of that is intercultural. Another is human diversity, in various forms. So there's many, many ways that it can think, but I think the principles apply to intentionally open ourselves.
Absolutely.
That's right. Absolutely.
One more question, and that is, you mentioned this a little bit, but I want to draw it out of you. What resources have you developed that might help other churches in exploring this subject of, not just being...
excuse me just one second.
Sure.
Sorry.
No, so what resources you have kind of developed that might help other churches exploring and taking steps, not in just interculturally, but also in other areas of transitioning out? What are some of the things that you developed? You mentioned podcasts.
I get really nervous whenever we try to think of anything that is a template. The podcasts that I developed, the open out podcasts, are really designed about some of the different things that different communities along the journey might need. But I think the most important thing, I think it comes back to Damber stuff. I think it's a spiritual. I think we screwed up all the time. We did stuff wrong all the time. And I would, for instance, like mispronouncing names. I could never pronounce anybody's name right. I would screw up all the time, all kinds of stuff, and make faux pas. There's biblical phrase about the inclination of your heart. Which way is your heart inclining?
Mhm.
And I think that's the most important thing, is if your heart is inclining in the right direction towards openness, towards love, towards welcoming, towards all those things, that goes a long way. We weren't very sophisticated. We weren't very, there were all kinds, I'm sure there were all kinds of times that I trampled over Damber's. I must have done things where he would have come home and told Sumitra, you wouldn't believe what that guy did today. I think the most important thing is helping our hearts to adapt. And a part of that is getting rid of fear.
Yeah.
Just saying, you don't need to be afraid. Okay, you may not understand, but you don't need to be afraid. And so to me, those are the most important things. But Damber, what would you think are the most important things?
I think this, it takes inspiration for a person to stand strong and move on, even in the mid of the challenges and struggles. If Sumitra was not beside me to uplift me at the time when I was down, I would not be continuing till this day. I would have given up already. But she had stood as an inspirator to me and kept fueling in me some kind of energy
and hope.
Yeah, exactly. And that we need someone beside us to encourage us, inspire us, and fuel us when our spirit is really, really down. That's even in the church life. Like if people see pastor as their everything. Pastor is a doctor, pastor is a lawyer, pastor is even sometimes I needed to go to the farmhouses 2 hours drive from Winnipeg to patch goat and chicken for people. And the church would not pay me money for the mileage. That's very personal thing that I would be spending from my side, to help my community. I know it's not the comfort zone at all. But I still need to do that, to gain their relationship, to gain their trust. That sometimes I need to go out of my comfort zone and do something new. That's my experience, and that has always been uplifting part in my ministry. And the other thing is that I did not hesitate to reach out to people like Reverend Bill Millar. I would just go to them and ask the question, whatever I feel. If I had hesitated, I would not move on. I would not move on. So these are the things. And always I looked at keeping people in the contact, like who would I reach to? Okay, if this should happen to me, who would I reach to? I need some kind of backup. So that's how I was vigilant of. Like I always try to find someone to show me as a backup. That's what thing that I did. And
Thank you. Yeah,